Hey guys, tonight we're slipping into a world where the walls whisper, the taverns snicker, and even the church bells seem to toll with double meaning. You're walking down a cobbled medieval street. Dust in the air, a pig nosing through someone's dinner scraps, and just beyond the baker's stall, you catch a conversation you're absolutely not supposed to hear. The man mutters something about a merchant's wife, her sister, and a night no one's supposed to talk about. Before we begin, take a moment to breathe. And if you're comfortable, share in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it for you? That's right. Tonight we're digging into a side of the Middle Ages your high school textbook definitely skipped. The not-so-holy truth about threesomes in medieval times. From noble bedrooms to haylofts, from bathhouses to cloisters, desire didn't follow the rules. Because humans never really do. And spoiler alert, you probably wouldn't survive a single scandalous night back then. Either you'd get caught, punished, or just develop a rash from the sheets. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and the time you're listening down in the comments. Let's see how global and tired this curious little history club really is. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You wake up in a room that smells like wood smoke, ale, and something vaguely sour. You're in a medieval inn, likely 14th century, judging by the wattle and daub walls and the lice in your tunic. Outside, a rooster crows over the sound of wheels on stone. But inside, the real noise is quieter, murmurs, chuckles, the swish of a dress, and the soft thunk of a wine jug hitting the table. People didn't talk openly about sex in the Middle Ages, not in the way we do now. But they still talk, just lower, behind closed doors, with raised eyebrows and double meanings. You catch three men at the next table gossiping. Something about a lord's daughter, two farmhands, and the goat stable incident. You weren't ready for that mental image, and frankly, neither were they. Sex, especially anything non-standard like a threesome, was officially off limits, according to the church, which at this point in history controls basically everything. It shapes morality, law, and even bedroom behavior. But here's the kicker. The more the church preaches against something, the more curious people become. This tension, the sacred versus the deeply unsacred, is everywhere. Walk through the city square and you'll see a public whipping. What you won't see is that just the night before, one of those guards was in on it, in more ways than one. Your path takes you through a back alley, past a textile shop, where two women lean out an upstairs window. One calls to a boy delivering firewood. "That's the one from yesterday," she laughs. "Brought his brother last time, too." You can't tell if she's joking, but the sparkle in her says it wouldn't be the first time. Medieval sexuality is full of contradictions. Take brothels. In some towns, they're sanctioned by the church itself. Because, believe it or not, it was considered the lesser evil to let unmarried men do their business somewhere regulated rather than disturb the moral peace of decent women. So official sinning, with receipts. But here's the twist. Even brothels had rules. You could get thrown out for being excessively unnatural, which historians argue may have included things like group sex or same-sex encounters. Then again, others say these places were far more open than records admit. After all, no one exactly wrote Tuesday. Regular client brought two friends in the parish ledger. In the countryside, where priests were far away and gossip moved slowly, things were looser. You pass a barn and hear laughter. Inside, a young couple is chasing a third person around a haystack. You decide not to watch. You're already itchy from the last hayloft detour. And yet, for every whispered story you hear, there's a chance it's more myth than memory. Historians still argue whether threesomes in medieval Europe were common practice or just salacious rumor. Did people really indulge, or did their imaginations do most of the work? Some say records were exaggerated, often by jealous rivals, confessing sinners, or nosy neighbors with too much wine. Still, even the existence of those rumors says something. You don't imagine what isn't already floating around in the cultural soup. And in this town, that soup is spicy. You reach a tiny chapel and slip inside. amongst praying, or maybe he's sleeping. A woman walks past you toward the altar. Behind her, her sister. They kneel together. You don't know their story, but you've already learned this much. The most interesting sins never happen where you'd expect. The truth about sex in the Middle Ages isn't in the laws or sermons. It's in the silences, in the glances, the folk songs, the dirty carvings tucked under choir benches. It's there, in three voices moaning behind a closed shutter, somewhere just out of reach. And you're just getting started. The air gets cooler as you wander out of the chapel. A few crows squabble overhead, perched on the mossy stone ledges of a ruined cloister. It's here in places like this, abandoned, overgrown, and forgotten by the devout, that you start to understand how layered medieval life really was. You've got saints carved on walls, yes, but also tucked just beneath the folds of pious routine, you'll find wild little stories sprouting like weeds. Let's talk about marriage. The medieval kind, not the till death do us part fairy tale nonsense, but the deeply practical, often awkward, sometimes deeply unromantic contracts they were. You didn't marry for love. You married for land, goats, or your father's reputation. And what happens when that marriage is cold as a November pond? You find warmth somewhere else. You're visiting a modest manor tonight. Wooden beams overhead, rushes on the floor, a roaring hearth. The lady of the house sits by the fire, embroidering. Her husband, 20 years her senior, is asleep in the next room, snoring like a beast. She glances up as two of her attendants giggle nearby, one pouring wine, the other unbraiding the other's hair. There's something in the air. It smells like baked apples and unspoken plans. In noble households, discretion was a luxury. Walls were thin, gossip thinner. Still, the elite played their own game. If you had enough power or enough bribes, you could make nearly anything disappear. There are surviving court records of noblemen caught in menages of considerable novelty, involving not just fellow nobles, but kitchen staff, squires, and the occasional lute player. Of course, things didn't always end well. There's a French countess who famously disappeared after it was discovered she'd invited two of her late husband's pages to comfort her in grief. Historians still argue whether she fled into hiding or was quietly eliminated to preserve the family name. Either way, there's poetry about her, so that's something. But even outside the castles, among the merchant class or middling gentry, the rules of marriage weren't always followed to the letter. You walk through a modest home in a thriving town, a place where trade bustles and morals get a little foggy in the marketplace. A wool trader's wife leans across a stall to whisper to a friend. Her husband is away in Bruges. Her neighbor, however, is very much not. Urban life allowed for a kind of anonymity rural villagers could only dream of. And with anonymity came opportunity. You walk past a shared garden where 3 cloaks hang on a branch and no one's gardening. Still, let's not paint this as some non-stop medieval romp. Adultery was dangerous. For women especially, the cost was severe. Public shame, exile, or worse. The church deemed extramarital sex a mortal sin. Doubly so if it involved more than 2. Threesomes weren't just frowned upon. They were damned in sermons, scrawled about in cautionary tales, and sometimes punished by death. But, and here's the human twist, those very warnings only seem to make the idea more enticing. Enter the confessional. You find one in the shadowy corner of a small church, dark and smelling faintly of incense and mildew. A woman kneels, whispering behind the lattice. Her voice shakes, but not from shame, from thrill. She tells the priest about a moment of weakness, a night involving herself, her husband, and her husband's cousin. The priest sighs, gives penance, but you catch him later, scribbling furiously in a private journal, his ears still red. What's fascinating is that confessions like these, though meant to be secret, were often used to compile sin catalogs, collections of the weird, the wild, and the deeply frowned upon. Some of these documents survive. One 13th century bishop complained that too many women tempt their husbands with the addition of another body. We're guessing that wasn't in the wedding vows. And yet, not all threesomes were acts of rebellion. Some were seen, though rarely spoken of as acts of service. A woman helping her friend conceive when a husband was sterile. A man assisting his lord's marriage when an heir was urgently needed. In a world where lineage mattered more than pleasure, sometimes you bent the rules to make the story work. One fringe account describes a healer who blessed marital unions by watching or occasionally joining, claiming to bring fertile balance through shared intimacy. Historians still debate whether this was ritual, scam, or just a lonely man with a clever excuse. You end your stroll back where you started. Near the inn, firelight flickering from behind the shutters. Inside, a bard sings of a night, a lady, and her chambermaid. The chorus gets louder with each verse. It's bawdy, yes, but oddly romantic. A tale where the three fall in love, ride off together, and disappear into the forest. A fantasy? Probably. But the crowd loves it. Someone tosses a coin. Someone else winks. And you realize, in a world that tried so hard to control desire, desire found its way anyway, through songs, side glances, and secret arrangements after dark. Not bad for a time when soap was optional. The dawn mist hasn't lifted yet as you press further into the heart of town. Cobblestone alleys still glisten from the night dew, and the first bread carts creak into the market square. But your path veers off into a narrower lane, a street where scandal walks in soft shoes. You duck into a dim, timbered building. No signs, no windows, only a red ribbon tied to the door handle. Congratulations, you found a medieval brothel, or, as they were politely referred to in some places, stew houses. Sounds cozy, right? Here's the surprising part. In many towns, brothels were perfectly legal, regulated, taxed. Some were even owned by the church. No joke, there's a record of a bishop in Winchester running several, all above board, just not above morality. That's where it gets deliciously complex. You pass into a main room. Low ceilings, straw-stuffed mattresses, candle smoke swirling like gossip. A girl laces up her bodice while two others argue over who gets the next customer. Who, incidentally, is already snoring in the corner. Not all clients were solitary. Sometimes a group of men would arrive, drunk and daring. And sometimes they didn't come for just one girl. You pause at a curtained-off space where two women laugh behind the fabric, whispering about a customer too shy to choose. Guess what they chose for him? In brothels, threesomes weren't uncommon. They were a menu item. For an extra coin, a man might request two women, or a couple might arrive seeking novelty. Yes, couples. Married ones even. In a time when passion was often boxed in by duty, some people sought release in corners society preferred not to look. But let's not pretend this was all harmless mischief. Life in a brothel could be brutal. Girls were often trafficked, sold by desperate parents, or indebted beyond escape. Historians still argue whether regulated brothels protected women or merely institutionalized their exploitation. The truth likely rides in the middle. Yet, paradoxically, brothels were one of the few places a woman could earn above average wages. Some madams became wealthy, powerful, even respected. In 14th century Paris, one Dame Mariette ran a 5-story house with tiled baths, imported perfumes, and a private guard. Her clientele? Nobles, clerics, merchants, sometimes all three at once. Literally. And yes, there are accounts, scratched into the margins of court records, of noblemen caught mid-trio in establishments like hers. One tale involves a Hungarian ambassador, 2 French courtesans, and a misunderstanding about whose boots belonged to whom. You can't make this stuff up. Well, technically someone did, but the records exist. You tiptoe down a narrow hall and peer into a side room. A young man plays a lute, while 2 older women feed him wine and peel off his cloak. There's laughter, yes, but also weariness. A kind of performance that doesn't always end with applause. Still, there's undeniable intimacy here, an understanding that human desire is more complicated than Scripture would like. In a society obsessed with heaven, these places dealt in earth. And what's more human than messiness? You step out the back, into an alley where a nun passes briskly, nose wrinkled. She's seen it all before. Some convents had brothels as neighbors. Some nuns left the convent, changed their name, and reappeared in the service industry. And sometimes it didn't even leave. Letters from the 12th century complain of sisters entertaining company on feast nights. Historians still debate how widespread this was, or whether these tales were anti-clerical slander. Either way, the whispers were hard to silence. Just around the corner, a tavern begins to stir. This was the brothel's cousin, slightly less formal, slightly more chaotic. Alehouses often blurred the line between drink and dalliance. You pass a side room where a merchant couple, married, share a bench with a barmaid whose laugh is just a little too practiced. The man fumbles with a purse. The woman pretends not to care. The barmaid takes both their hands. Group encounters didn't always happen in secret. Festivals, midsummer bonfires, and harvest dances sometimes turned into little pockets of suspended rules. There's a documented festival in parts of Germany where, for one night, custom allowed 3 to share a blanket, if love insisted. And yes, you guessed it, some blankets got crowded. The church tried to crack down on this. Synods passed decrees. Preachers warned of hellfire for those who fornicate in company. But fire and brimstone sermons didn't always compete well with warm cider and long skirts, especially when the alternative was a cold marriage and colder bed. What's striking is how open some medieval people were, behind closed doors at least, about pushing those boundaries. There's a surviving letter from a Florentine merchant apologizing to his wife for an affair with her best friend and their cook. He blamed the wine. She apparently blamed the cook, but she took him back. And yet, the same society that allowed such indulgences also had brutal double standards. A woman caught in a threesome risked far more than a man. Shame, punishment, sometimes worse. But behind the locked doors of brothels and bathhouses, some women found small ways to reclaim power, even pleasure. A fleeting kind of equality that only existed in shadows. You glance up at a window above where someone draws the curtain back just an inch. A candle flickers behind them. Someone watching, or waiting, or maybe remembering. In this world of contradictions, of sin taxed and virtue sold, desire danced between danger and delight. And if you're wondering whether that shy friar from earlier ever visited places like these, well, remember the saying, asterisk, even the holiest walk through mud to reach the river. Asterisk, the scent hits you before the doorway does. Wet hay, beeswax polish, and a lingering hint of incense. You're in the manor house now. Well, not yours, obviously. You're in the company of someone wealthier with fresher linens and floors that don't squeak as much. You follow your host, an aging baron with a limp and a smirk, through a wide hall decorated with faded tapestries. One depicts a hunting scene. The other, if you squint, might be a biblical tale. Or maybe just a party gone wrong. Hard to tell with medieval stitching. He's invited you for supper, he says. But supper's over. The guests have gone. And yet, he beckons you deeper. Through the solar, past a snoring hound, into the master chamber. And there, reclining on a high feather stuffed bed, are not one, but 2 women. One is his wife. The other, quite obviously, is not. This is no brothel, no stew house scandal. This is a private arrangement, carefully, quietly orchestrated behind stone walls and velvet curtains. Welcome to the world of noble threesomes. It happened more than you think, but far less than the rumors would like. Among the upper classes, sex was as much about power as pleasure. Marriage was business. Desire, when it surfaced, had to sneak out through side passages. Sometimes, though, it didn't sneak, it strutted. There are documented cases of noblemen keeping multiple lovers under the same roof, even arranging what modern minds might call ménages à trois. Some were formal, contracted mistresses with rooms of their own. Others were fluid, fleeting, and orchestrated under flickering candlelight. A 14th century letter from a German count to his steward lists travel arrangements, feast menus, and a request to prepare suitable chambers for the Lady Helvig and the Lady Juliet, together, as they have lately grown fond of each other's company. Interpret as you will. Historians certainly have. You move closer, try not to stumble over a bear fur rug. The baron's wife is pouring wine into 3 goblets. She glances at you, not nervously, but with something like appraisal. The other woman, her sister, perhaps, her handmaiden, her companion in far more than prayers, offers a slow smile. Let's be clear, in noble households, appearances were everything. If a third person joined the bedroom, it was often veiled under terms like entertainment, companionship, or relaxation. There's a famous case of a queen's maid being assigned to her husband while the queen was away. When questioned, the response was, asterisk, better she knows her partner's pleasures than he seek them elsewhere. Asterisk, and yes, that answer came from the queen herself. Of course, most of these arrangements were lopsided. A nobleman bringing in two women? Tolerated, even admired. A noblewoman doing the same? Scandal. Dangerous. Often punishable, unless she had the right protection. One French noblewoman, Marguerite de la Roque, was rumored to keep both male and female companions. When discovered, she was exiled, alone, to an island. Her story ends in tragedy, with bones found beside a crumbling chapel. Historians still argue whether the charges were true or just courtly slander. But here, in this dim chamber, no one looks scandalized. No one flinches. The three of them laugh. And suddenly, you're not a participant. You're just watching. A ghost in the corner of memory. What's fascinating is how this part of history rarely made it into official chronicles. Kings and popes kept meticulous records of wars and taxes, but their bedroom arrangements? Either omitted, destroyed, or coyly encoded in poems and private letters. That's how we know about King Edward II, for instance. His close companions, Gaveston and later Despenser, were granted lands, titles, and unusually intimate lodging. His queen, Isabella, was not amused. Eventually, she led a rebellion, and Edward died horribly. The irony? We know more about his downfall than his desires. But let's not get too distracted by royalty. Among lesser nobles, similar arrangements cropped up in quieter ways. During winter months, castles grew crowded. Guests shared rooms, sometimes beds. Company was a survival tactic as much as a pleasure. The line between practicality and passion often blurred. One quirky account from a Flemish household inventory lists 3 matching nightshirts for use in the shared chamber of Lady Annette and her companions. Shared chamber, plural companions. Draw your own conclusions. And just when you think the manor holds no more secrets, you're ushered into a side room. A smaller chamber, with thick curtains and a brazier glowing red. On the table sits a tray, 2 peeled pomegranates, a flask of almond milk, and a tin of powdered ginger. Aphrodisiacs, all of them. Not superstition, but strategy. This wasn't just lust. It was performance, ritual, control, and often a way to strengthen alliances. A nobleman might share a mistress with a political rival to seal trust or entrap them. Threesomes could be tools of manipulation, not just indulgence. Think less romantic comedy, more chessboard. But here's the twist. Some of these arrangements weren't forced. There are letters, fragments of parchment smudged with wax, that suggest mutual affection. A man writing to both his beloved hearts, thanking them for their song the night before. A woman penning a poem to my 2 moons, who light my bed as twin torches. Poetic license? Sure, but desire has always written in metaphor. Historians still debate how common such relationships were, especially among women. There's far less documentation of female-female-male threesomes, or female-female ones full stop. Was it truly rare? Or simply erased by chroniclers who couldn't imagine, or refused to record? Women directing desire? You stand now in the flickering shadows, watching 3 people move in synchrony. Not rushed, not reckless, but rehearsed. They've done this before. Maybe not often, but with care. Because in a world where power lived in every glance, every touch had weight. Outside, the wind howls against the shutters. Inside, laughter rises soft, knowing, rich with secrets. And you? You tiptoe out of the room, heartbeat steady, as though you've touched something ancient. And perhaps, in a way, you wake up to the soft drip of water from the thatched eaves above, the kind of gentle rhythm that blends with the song of morning doves and the far-off clatter of hooves on cobbled stones. Your feet swing over the edge of the straw-stuffed mattress, and you stretch, the cold biting at your ankles. You're not in a manor today. You're in a monastery, and not just any monastery, but one where the vow of celibacy hums through the hallways like incense. At least in theory. Monks and nuns, of course, were supposed to be paragons of restraint, chaste, obedient, cloistered from temptation. You probably think of them copying books by candlelight or plucking sad notes on a psaltery. And yes, they did that. But they were also very, very human. And when the vow of celibacy rubbed against flesh and blood desire, let's just say the results weren't always holy. You walk slowly past the scriptorium, where a sleepy brother scratches away at parchment, tongue sticking out in concentration. Behind him, tucked away in the margins of a sacred manuscript, is a naked couple wrestling joyfully under a tree. Tiny, irreverent, and grinning. Illuminators weren't subtle. That little sketch, it may not have been hypothetical. There are records, official, uncomfortable records, of threesomes within religious houses. In 1320, for instance, the Bishop of Winchester was informed of a situation most dire at the Abbey of St. Oswin. 2 monks and a young novice were discovered engaging in acts of indecent intimacy, one of which took place in the chapter house. The reaction? Public penance, reassignment, a few quiet disappearances, but the truth wriggled out between the lines. Historians still argue whether such records were exaggerated by rivals or genuinely represented common occurrences. Some even believe that the very strictness of the cloister created pressure cookers of desire, especially when men or women were kept in close quarters, isolated from the outside world for years at a time. When your whole life is structured, your thoughts strictly watched, even a shared glance at the laundry line might start to feel like a love letter. And let's not forget the nuns. The nuns. Cloistered, yes, but not blind. In the 12th century, a German abbess named Hildegard of Bingen wrote extensively on divine visions and sacred music. But some of her letters to her favorite sisters read less like theology and more like love-struck prose. In one, she writes, "Your absence is a wound, a silence I cannot hymn away." There's a famous 14th century case of a nun named Agnes who ran a secret correspondence with a neighboring monk, Brother Thomas. The letters grew increasingly flowery. Eventually, they arranged a midnight meeting under the guise of prayer. Only they didn't come alone. A third figure, unnamed, was seen with them in the garden. One chronicler snidely remarked, "They gathered not to praise the Lord, but to worship flesh threefold." Of course, not all stories end in scandal. Some nuns formed communities of deep emotional intimacy, what modern scholars call spiritual friendships. But even these blurred lines. In one Italian convent, 3 sisters were buried side by side in a shared tomb, their epitaph reading, *, bound in life, bound in death. *, were they friends? Lovers? A chosen family of sorts? No one knows for sure, but the closeness is undeniable. You wander now past the infirmary, where a brother gently bathes another's feet. The basin steams, and their hands linger. It could be devotion, or it could be more. The rule books say no touching outside of necessity. But necessity in a monastery is often in the eye of the beholder. In 1253, a papal investigation uncovered a group of Benedictine monks who held secret nighttime gatherings in the sacristy. At first, they defended them as scriptural study. Later, under pressure, one confessed what he called acts of triple passion. We're not told what those acts were, but the phrase stuck, passed down in quiet footnotes for centuries. One fringe theory even suggests that some monastic architecture subtly enabled these liaisons. Small passageways, double-locked doors, alcoves near the gardens. Whether by design or later adaptation, the buildings often knew what the rules did not. And here's a curious tidbit. In some places, the punishment for breaking celibacy was lighter if it involved another monk rather than a layperson. The logic? Better to sin among the flock than invite scandal from the outside. This created a strange loophole, one that occasionally widened. Now you find yourself in the chapel. The morning sun slants through stained glass, painting red and gold over the stone floor. You kneel, not to pray, but to read the etchings on the pew, scratches made by idle hands over centuries. One reads, M plus J plus S, brothers forever. Another, just a set of initials surrounded by hearts. Even here, in the house of God, desire found a way. Not always sinfully, sometimes gently, sometimes with deep tenderness, but always there, humming under the robes, hidden in hymns, whispered between confessionals. You rise and exit through the cloister, your footsteps soft against the worn flagstones. Behind you, chants begin, deep, echoing solemn. But you can't help wondering if those voices once trembled for something more than piety. Because in the stillness of medieval monasteries, even the quietest hearts sometimes beat in threes. You walk now with a steady clip-clop of wooden pattens underfoot, following the trail of mud and rosemary branches into a town that's hosting something special, a medieval wedding. The banners are flying. There's meat roasting over spits. There's music, badly tuned but enthusiastic, and there's just the right hint of panic in the air. Because when it comes to sex and threesomes in the Middle Ages, few things made things more complicated than marriage. Not that people didn't try to get married for love. They absolutely did. But you're in a time when love was often a side dish, not the main course. Marriages were contracts, property exchanges wrapped in veils and prayers. And where there's property, there's negotiation. Sometimes a woman came into the marriage with her own assets. Sometimes her dowry included servants or companions, some of whom stayed surprisingly close. In one 14th century case from Burgundy, a nobleman's wife and her lady's maid were so often seen sharing chambers that the local priest noted it in his personal ledger, writing, "The Lord's house bears 3 keys, but there's only 1 bed." Historians still argue whether this was simply a matter of warmth or something more layered. Either way, the rumor stuck. You settle now by the well, listening to the soft gossip of townsfolk as they gather to see the wedding procession. In a low voice, someone mentions the groom's past entanglement with 2 sisters, both of whom still live in the village. They used to pick herbs together, an older woman murmurs, and sometimes went quiet when a man came by. There's laughter, then a pause. You can feel the knowledge hanging in the air like wood smoke. Married life, in theory, was supposed to be monogamous. Church law certainly insisted on it. But reality? Reality was flexible, especially among the nobility. In 1322, Countess Isabeau of Foix was discovered maintaining an intimate friendship not only with her husband, but with his steward. When a suspicious bishop pressed for clarification, the steward was quietly reassigned to a remote outpost. Isabeau's marriage continued, her reputation intact. If a little glossier, among peasants, things were trickier. Fewer records survive, but occasional hints appear. A single surviving court roll from Kent mentions a man fined for lying with his wife and her sister within the same fortnight, in the same bed, by his own telling. His punishment? A public penance and a small fine. It's not the sort of thing you find someone for unless it happened fairly often. Of course, some threesomes weren't born out of pleasure, but out of necessity. In households where space was limited, multiple people slept together just to stay warm. Bodies pressed together in the dark and lines blurred. There are tales, whispered more than written, of a woman, her husband, and his brother sharing a sleeping loft through the coldest winter, with God's grace said to be the only thing separating flesh from sin. And then there's the matter of fertility. In some parts of Europe, especially where superstition and folk belief ran strong, if a couple couldn't conceive, they might invite a third person to bless the bed. Usually a relative, sometimes a stranger, occasionally, if the stories are to be believed, a priest or a midwife. These rituals blurred spiritual and sexual lines, their purpose more functional than erotic. But still, 3 bodies, 1 bed, an open question. Here's a curious tidbit. In some remote communities, wedding night rituals involved witnesses, and not just standing outside the door. In 12th century Friesland, it was customary for the bride's closest friend or even her mother to stay in the room until the marriage was properly sealed. Some accounts suggest they even assisted. Whether physically or verbally is well left unsaid. But the lines between observer and participant, once again, they wobble. Historians still argue whether these rituals were ever intended to be erotic or whether modern readers just want them to be. The truth is, they were probably both awkward and intimate, steeped in custom, but not immune to desire. You move now to the edge of the feast, where the couple sits under a flower-draped canopy. The bride is laughing, flushed, and her eyes flick toward her maid of honor a little too often. The groom whispers something to a nearby squire. You catch the edge of the sentence, only if she agrees. There's a knowing smile. Is it just flirtation, or something arranged? Sometimes, marriages made room for multiple kinds of affection. Not openly, of course, but under the surface. In the 14th century Book of Hours belonging to a noblewoman in Toulouse, one marginalia illustration shows a man, a woman, and another woman holding hands under a flowering tree. It's stylized, symbolic, maybe even innocent, but its presence in a prayer book raises eyebrows to this day. As the sun dips lower, you hear a slow drumbeat begin. The villagers start to dance in a wide circle. Some couples, some not. At the center, the bride and groom spin, and then, playfully, they each pull someone else into the ring. Now there are 4, then 5, a tangle of laughter, motion, and music. You sit back on a barrel and think. Marriage in the Middle Ages was never just about 2 people. It was about family alliances, household economies, shared survival, and occasionally quiet indulgences that didn't make it into the church registers. Because while the vows may have said forsaking all others, the reality, it often said, just be discreet. You wake up now in a haze of bells and incense, the air thick with burning myrrh and the scent of candle wax dripping onto old stone floors. You're inside a monastery, not just any monastery, but one that's seen centuries of whispered sins and badly kept secrets. And you're here to peek into a world where chastity was the rule and breaking it. Well, let's just say the walls remember. Monks and nuns took vows. Poverty, obedience, chastity. In theory, that meant no sex, no relationships, no indulgence beyond the spiritual. In reality, the rulebook was often read with one eye closed. You glance down the cloister hallway, where 2 young novices are kneeling side by side, their hands just a little too close. They're murmuring Latin prayers, yes, but their shoulders keep brushing. One of the strangest truths of the Middle Ages is how often religious spaces became sites of subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, exploration. You're in a world without Tinder, without magazines, without privacy. Put enough people in a shared, emotionally intense space, especially young people forbidden from acting on their desires. And yes, sometimes you get stories. Let's be clear, not all monastic communities were dens of scandal. Many were deeply committed, serious places. But even the church knew there were cracks. In 12th century England, Bishop Nigel of Ely wrote a letter complaining that monks in one abbey lay 3 to a bed and often sang late into the night songs of Venus, not the Psalter. Historians still argue whether this was literal, exaggerated, or simply poetic complaint. But the implication? Some beds had more going on than snoring. You pause at a chapel door and peek in. Inside, an older monk is reading from a large, hand-illuminated Bible. You can't help but notice that the margin art includes 2 rabbits kissing under a vine. Cute? Definitely. Innocent? Maybe not entirely. Medieval scribes had a wicked sense of humor, and some of the images they left behind, like monks spanking each other or nuns cuddling foxes, a euphemism for, well, you get the idea, suggest that someone was laughing behind the manuscript pages. There's even a surviving sermon from the 13th century that begins, "Dear brethren, beware the sins of Sodom and of Sarah's maidservants, for temptation may wear the face of friend." Not subtle. And the fact that this warning was repeated across several different monastic orders hints that they weren't dealing with hypothetical situations. Now here's a quirky tidbit for you. In one Flemish convent, nuns wrote love poetry to each other, hiding it between the pages of devotional books. One poem reads, She holds my hand during Compline slash, and I am pierced like Saint Sebastian. It's beautiful, aching. It makes you wonder how many more of these confessions were lost to time or burned during reformations. And yes, threesomes, even here behind thick monastery walls, are not outside the realm of possibility. There's a preserved letter from the 14th century, written by a bishop investigating rumors at a small priory in Aquitaine. He mentions a brotherhood of 3 who shared a single sleeping cell and did not rise for morning prayers on feast days. The implication is whispered, but clear. Something more than snoozing was happening behind those doors. You tiptoe now past the scriptorium, where quills scratch against vellum. A young monk catches your eye and quickly looks away, a blush rising to his cheeks. You wonder who he's thinking about. Maybe someone he shouldn't be. Maybe 2 someones. Of course, not all these relationships were equal or consensual. Power dynamics in monastic life were real and complicated. Abbots and abbesses held immense authority, and sometimes that authority was abused. The church tried to police it, issuing edicts, conducting surprise inspections, but desire doesn't always listen to decrees. One particularly infamous case comes from 13th century Germany, where an abbess and 2 of her closest novices were accused of forming a trinity of flesh and conducting nighttime rituals involving oil, chanting, and, according to one witness, kisses of the Passion. The investigation quietly vanished after the abbess's family paid a generous donation to the bishopric. The priory still stands today, its official history scrubbed clean. It's worth noting that the line between sin and salvation was often blurry. The medieval mind was steeped in allegory. A kiss could be both temptation and benediction. A shared bed could be comfort or corruption. Monks and nuns were humans first, saints second. And in spaces where silence reigned, whispers carried far. You step into the garden now, where herbs grow in tidy rows, sage, rue, and damiana. The last one, known back then for its invigorating qualities. Some monasteries banned its cultivation altogether, suspecting it stirred impure thoughts. Yet here it is, thriving beside the rosemary. You sit on a worn stone bench, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. You think of all the longing buried beneath these stones, all the secrets tucked between the psalms. And maybe, just maybe, you start to understand how a place built for discipline could so easily become a crucible for forbidden connection. The bell rings for vespers. Candles flicker in the refectory windows. A young monk places a hand on another's shoulder, just for a second too long. They disappear inside. The door creaks, close behind them. You don't expect to find yourself in a castle dungeon tonight. Not the damp, rat-infested kind, but something far more uncomfortable, the court of public opinion. You're standing at the center of a bustling medieval town square where scandal travels faster than plague, and rumor is as sharp as any sword. And oh, is your name on everyone's lips? You haven't even done anything yet. But in the Middle Ages, just looking suspicious was enough to raise eyebrows, if not pitchforks. The idea of a threesome, or any sexual behavior beyond the expected church-approved marriage bed, wasn't just taboo. It was dangerous. The moment a man or woman stepped out of line, society clutched its pearls and called the priest. That's where you are now, on the edge of respectability, teetering on a wooden platform, metaphorically if not literally. Your fingers twitch as you grip your cloak tighter, listening as townsfolk whisper. You hear the word lechery. You hear witchcraft. And, of course, the ever-dramatic devil's triangle. Let's be real. Medieval people were obsessed with labeling sins. There were entire books, literally called penitentials, that listed every imaginable offense and the punishment it earned. 2 men with a woman? That could land you 40 days of bread and water. A woman with 2 men? Triple the penance, and sometimes a whipping. And while threesomes weren't called by that name, they fell into a murky stew of fornication, group sin, and unnatural acts. The church kept creative with their phrasing. But what's fascinating is how much the public wanted to hear about these scandals, especially when it involved the elite. You drift toward the tavern, where a bard is already halfway through a saucy song about a local noblewoman, her two squires, and a missing jar of goose fat. It's exaggerated, sure, but it's based on someone, somewhere, doing something real. You sit in a corner of the room, ale in hand, listening as the lyrics dance around innuendo. One man strums a lute, while another mimes shock and delight. The crowd laughs, a few people blush, but no one leaves. Why? Because even in a world ruled by shame and silence, people couldn't resist a peek behind the curtain. And here's the twist. Those same people often held a double standard. A nobleman caught with two serving girls might be praised for his appetite. A poor man caught in a similar position could be beaten, fined, or worse. And for women, the consequences were often catastrophic. A woman accused of luring two lovers could be stripped of her dowry, tossed out of town, or, if things got particularly spicy, accused of sorcery. Historians still argue whether certain punishment records were exaggerated to scare the public or reflected actual enforcement. One thing's clear. If the wrong people heard the wrong thing at the wrong time, you were in serious trouble. Quirky side note, some towns employed professional scolds, women hired to shame others in public. Think of them as ancient gossip columnists with less mercy and more volume. If someone suspected you of hosting illicit company, the scold would sing about it in the market square, sometimes for hours, drawing a crowd and embarrassing you into repentance or exile. You walk now through narrow alleys, where lovers meet under the cover of night, and secrets drip from every overhanging beam. A merchant's wife flirts with a stable boy. Two apprentices whisper in hushed tones behind a barrel of fish. There's tension here, desire rubbing against fear, curiosity pressed tight against propriety. One real case, pulled from a dusty 14th century French court record. A widow was accused of keeping a bed too wide for one and too soft for piety. Her neighbors swore she entertained visitors in pairs. She defended herself, saying only, "My house is open, but my virtue is locked." Clever. Didn't stop the church from finding her and relocating her to a convent. And yet, behind closed doors, people kept exploring. Because even in a culture drenched in shame, humans remained, well, human. Passion didn't vanish because a bishop frowned. You lean against a timber frame and glance up at the stars. Somewhere out there, someone is lighting a candle, sliding under a fur blanket, and whispering secrets in not one ear, but two. This was the tension of medieval society, public morality versus private behavior. And when it came to anything even resembling a threesome, discretion was the only shield. If you were powerful, rich, or just lucky, you might get away with it. If you were caught, you'd better pray your confessor was sleepy or half-drunk. Speaking of confessions, the church used them not just to forgive, but to monitor. Parishioners were often asked pointed questions like, "Have you shared your bed with more than one soul in lust?" The answer, if yes, triggered penance, sometimes public, sometimes brutal. But it also served a darker purpose. It kept tabs. A priest who knew your sins could use them. Blackmail wasn't just for nobles. You duck into a side chapel now, a quiet little space beneath the cathedral. Candles flicker. A painted angel watches from above, one eyebrow raised. You get the feeling it knows exactly what you're thinking. Some scholars argue that these tight restrictions actually encouraged imaginative behavior. When you can't act freely, you get clever, timing your trysts between prayer bells, using code phrases, trusting only the most loyal friends. One medieval journal includes a shorthand symbol, a sort of upside-down Y, that scholars believe indicated a third companion present. The writer used it sparingly, but consistently. Now, as the village quiets and the moon rises, you realize something. Despite the gossip, the judgment, and the risk, people still sought connection. They still risked everything for moments of intimacy. They still whispered into the night, hoping the walls wouldn't echo back their names. And just maybe, while we don't condone their choices, you can understand why. You wake to the scent of wood smoke and baking bread, and for a moment, it feels like peace. But then, the bells toll, and not the comforting kind. These are warning bells, echoing through cobbled streets, and echoing louder inside your chest. Because today is not about passion or privacy. Today your feet are dragging towards something colder. The consequences. Not always for you, but for others who dance too close to the flame. You pass a crowd gathering around a wooden platform again. Not for entertainment this time, but for punishment. A young man stands shackled, hair disheveled, eyes low. Next to him, a woman in a tattered dress refuses to meet anyone's gaze. You overhear a whispered charge, lewdness in concert. It's the kind of phrase that makes a chill run down your spine. In many towns, these public displays were less about justice and more about control. The church, and often the local authorities, used public shaming to police morality. Whether or not the accused had actually engaged in anything remotely threesome-related was sometimes beside the point. If someone didn't like you, if your reputation wobbled, or if the village scold took offense, well, you might find yourself up on that platform before you had a chance to explain your side. What did punishment look like? It varied. In some places, it was a symbolic fine, a chicken, a candle, or 3 days of fasting. In others, it could be branding, exile, or worse. The spectacle was part of the punishment. You weren't just made to suffer. You were made into a cautionary tale. Historians still argue whether these events were staged more often than enforced. Some suggest they were exaggerated by chroniclers looking to emphasize the church's power. Others point to the surprisingly detailed records kept by town clerks and priests alike, showing case after case of people punished for sexual deviance, especially when more than 2 people were involved. There's even a case from Lübeck, in northern Germany, where a tavern maid was sentenced to parade through the streets wearing a hat made of goose feathers and ribbons, meant to symbolize her many lovers at once. A ridiculous, humiliating punishment. But more people remember her walk than the local mayor's speeches that year. You shuffle past the platform, head down, your own thoughts a little heavier now. The line between fantasy and fallout is razor thin in this world. But here's the part people rarely talk about: how punishment was often used as a smokescreen. Because behind those public floggings and stern sermons were nobles and clergy who lived double lives. Take Bishop Ralph of Bath. Rumors followed him for years, claiming his estate was home to lavish entertainments that would make even the French blush. When a stable boy tried to expose him, the boy was mysteriously sent to a monastery halfway across the kingdom. Coincidence? Or Queen Joanna of Naples, who was accused by her enemies of keeping male and female companions in equal measure. The scandal followed her into death, though modern historians still debate whether the stories were political slander or not-so-secret truths. One quirky tidbit from England. During the late 1300s, the city of Chester outlawed certain songs, claiming they inspired group lust. One of these tunes, The Weaver's Wife, was said to suggest a threesome between the titular woman, her husband, and a visiting knight. The melody survives today, though few know its racy roots. You pause beside a fountain, its basin covered in moss, and sit on the edge, letting the splash of cold water sting your fingers. You're reminded, sharply, that desire may be universal, but safety is not. Who gets punished, who gets protected? It's all about where you sit in the food chain. The poor and the powerless bore the brunt of moral policing. Meanwhile, the rich? They got better cloaks, better lawyers, and better lies. But even among the common folk, you'd find layers of secrecy. Some couples created elaborate decoys, friends who distract the neighbors while a third visitor slipped in unnoticed. Certain brothels even had hidden rooms, not just for discretion, but for configurations outside the norm. And while no records explicitly labeled these spaces for threesomes, the architectural clues suggest more than simple one-on-one encounters. You wander now into the courtyard of a nunnery, quiet, orderly, sacred. But even here, you sense layers beneath the calm. Not scandalous ones necessarily, but deeply human ones. Nuns lived under vows of chastity, but they also lived in community, emotionally intimate, physically close, sometimes for decades. What passed between them at night? We may never know. But the church kept a close eye. Some convents required women to sleep with hands visible above the blanket at all times. Others imposed confession drills, where sisters were asked to report on one another. Whether real sin existed or not, the fear always did. And yet, in all of this, every shameful whisper, every judgmental glare, every harsh penalty, there remains an undeniable truth. These rules weren't built to protect holiness. They were built to protect order. Sexual expression, especially in non-traditional forms like threesomes, was a threat, not to morality, but to hierarchy. Who shared power? Who chose whom? Who led the dance? These weren't just personal questions, they were political ones. You rise now, walking toward the edge of the village, past the fields where wheat sways and the horizon softens. The bells have stopped. The crowd has dispersed. The wind carries no more accusations. And for the first time today, you feel the tension ease. Because here, away from town, with only the stars for witnesses, you remember something essential. Desire was never the crime. The real crime was being caught without the right story to cover it. A rooster calls in the distance, late, confused, or simply rebellious. Either way, its cracked crow reminds you. Even in the rigid world of medieval law and punishment, cracks always appeared. And through those cracks, life, messy, beautiful, tangled, found a way to spill out. You follow a dirt path now, winding past a row of wind-warped cottages. The people who live here are quieter, poorer, often hungrier, but also freer in a strange way. Out here, the church still reigns, but it doesn't watch as closely. And where watchfulness thins, honesty sometimes rushes in. In one of these homes, a widow has taken in two farmhands. They work the fields together. They share meals. They sleep, technically, in the same room, though no one asks who sleeps where. Villagers whisper, but mostly they leave her alone. After all, she pays her tithe, keeps her garden tidy, and never, ever gossips. This is where threesomes most often lived, in silence, in hints, in shadows that never quite made it into the record books. Historians still argue whether rural life gave people more sexual autonomy or simply pushed them further into secrecy. Some say remote communities were more relaxed about unusual arrangements. Others argue that the fear of being outcast was even sharper in small villages, where everyone's business was everyone's business, and you couldn't so much as sneeze without someone telling the priest. But evidence does survive. In the margins of tax rolls, in scribbled confessions, in forgotten court documents. One account from 1327 describes a tenant farmer, his wife, and the woman listed as their apprentice. A dispute with a neighbor led to a legal hearing where accusations spilled out, jealousy, slander, and the claim that they slept as three. The judge dismissed it as hearsay, but the record remains. And then there's the matter of traveling performers. Oh yes, you pass a ragtag group on the edge of the woods. A juggler, a piper, a woman in a red scarf that hides her mouth when she smiles. Troubadours, puppeteers, mummers, they drifted between towns, entertaining peasants and princes alike. And though the church frowned on their bawdy songs and suggestive plays, people welcomed them with eager hands and coin. So those songs, let's just say they didn't stop at love triangles. There's one Catalan verse that involves a shepherd, his lover, and a visiting merchant with golden hands. Another from Occitania describes a playful wager between a lady, her knight, and her maid. The lyrics dance around the specifics, but the implications are clear. And when the sun went down and the ale flowed freely, many of those performers didn't sleep alone. One wandering poet wrote in his journal, "Yes, we do have it, about a night beneath a hay cart spent with 4 feet, 3 names, and no regrets." Of course, not every story ends in laughter. You reach a monastery's crumbling outer wall, where the air feels cooler, tighter. This was a place of vows, of silence, celibacy, and reflection, but not immunity. In one archived letter from a 14th century monk to his abbot, there's an almost painfully awkward apology for what he calls the sharing of affections. He mentions a visiting novice and a senior brother. No graphic details, just guilt and worry. I fear my silence makes me complicit, he writes. It's not clear whether he was punished or whether anyone else was. The paper ends there. Still, the letter tells us what official doctrine tried to erase. That even in the most holy spaces, human connection and human curiosity couldn't be scrubbed out. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In medieval Wales, one version of customary law listed fines for various offenses, including something called synfita. It's often translated as unlawful mixing. It may have referred to group intimacy outside of marriage. The fine? 2 cows and a cloak. Steep, depending on your wardrobe. As you move on, past hedgerows and sleepy fields, your feet follow the same paths trod by so many before you. They didn't leave behind Instagram posts or tabloid scandals. But their stories still linger in the bends of songs, the whispers in folk tales, the offhand notes in church ledgers. Threesomes in the medieval world weren't advertised. They weren't labeled. But they happened. Sometimes in love. Sometimes in survival. Sometimes in secret rebellion against a world that told you your body belonged to someone else. And sometimes, like now, they just existed as soft footprints beneath your own. Easy to miss if you aren't looking, but impossible to ignore once you start to see. You wake with the sharp scent of lavender and old wood smoke. There's bread baking somewhere nearby, and you feel the crick in your neck from sleeping in a crooked in bed. But it's morning again in medieval Europe, and this time, you're deep in the heart of a city. Not London, not Paris, but one of 1,000 bustling hubs where alleyways tangle like thoughts, and the rules of the church clash with the hunger of the streets. You're about to discover that for every sermon preached from a stone pulpit, there's an equal and opposite transaction happening in a candlelit room just a few streets away. The house you enter doesn't announce itself. No red lanterns, no scandalous signs. Just a faded door, a discreet knock, and a woman in her 40s who asks your name with the crisp authority of someone who's been doing this for decades. She's a bawd, a brothel keeper, and she doesn't bother with euphemisms. You pay for time, not acts, she mutters. But if you want company, real company, you'll need coin and manners. And here's where things get interesting. Threesomes, in this context, weren't whispered sins. They were commodities, options on a menu. Not always, of course, but frequently enough that scholars raise their brows when combing through ledgers from cities like Bruges, Florence, and Avignon. One document from 1361 lists arrangement à trois, alongside bath attendants and lute playing. Did it involve intimacy or just coordinated cuddling with music? Historians still argue. But the trend's there. In major trade cities where merchants mixed, where papal emissaries dined alongside poets and bankers, the brothel became not just a place for release, but for indulgence. And among the options were menages, sometimes with all genders involved, depending on who paid and who played. Mainstream history often skips over this, preferring to paint brothels as seedy dens of sin. But in truth, many were regulated by local authorities. In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, licensed brothels paid taxes, followed curfews, and kept records. And yes, some of those records survive. The detail is minimal. Medieval shorthand was basically emoji with ink, but a few used symbols that suggest group arrangements. Of course, it wasn't all transactional. You overhear a story from a tired-looking scribe in the corner tavern, a favorite haunt of low-ranking clerics. He's drunk on mead and melancholy, and he slurs out the tale of a gentleman and 2 nuns who fled their monastery and lived in disguise as pilgrims of love. Did it happen? Did he make it up? Hard to say, but it made it into a local ballad, still hummed generations later. And there's the paradox of the church again, so eager to condemn sin, and yet so deeply fascinated by its details. One 13th century priest compiled a manual for confessors, detailing how to ask about sins involving more than 2 bodies. Was it to help souls, or to satisfy curiosity? A fringe theory among scholars suggests some priests kept confession notes not just for penance, but for gossip. Here's a quirky tidbit. In medieval Poland, a brothel called the House of the Bear reportedly employed a trio of women who performed together. What they performed isn't entirely clear. Some think it was theater, others suspect something closer to cabaret. But one traveler described it as entertainment that danced the line between song and sin. Even noble courts weren't immune. In the court of Burgundy, a satirical poem describes a feast where wine flowed, tongues loosened, and two ladies of rival virtue sought to tame the same night. It's framed as comedy, but the undertone is unmistakable. High society loved to laugh about scandal, as long as no one named names. By now, you realize that the deeper you go into the medieval world, the more you see that rigid rules were never the full story. The surface, yes, that belonged to bishops and judges and angry husbands. But beneath, there was a wild current, a living theater of hunger, choice, and improvisation. And sometimes the people playing in that theater found each other, not just in pairs, but in unexpected, tangled trios. You've heard the whispers in the candlelit inns and the markets. But tonight, you follow something colder, more calculated, the record keepers. You're standing now in the middle of a medieval courtroom, and all around you are scrolls, clerks, and the slow, thunderous shuffle of parchment. Because while the act might have happened in shadowy bedrooms and behind cloistered walls, the fallout, well, that made it into ink. And ink lasts. In this section of your journey, you're diving into the world of ecclesiastical courts, legal confessions, and a surprising paper trail left behind by threesomes gone. Inconvenient. Picture this. It's 1325 in York. A woman named Alice is dragged before a local church tribunal. The accusation? Carnal misconduct of a compounded nature. That's a real phrase. Her neighbors testified to sounds unfit for the hour, and worse. Two men seen leaving her house laughing, one of them missing a shoe. Historians still argue whether this case was exaggerated by nosy villagers or if Alice was simply ahead of her time. And it's not just England. In Avignon, during the papal residence, there's a record of a knight who was fined heavily for sundering holy chastity with the help of two unmarried sisters. Whether they were actually sisters is another debate. Scribes had a flair for drama. What's remarkable isn't just that these threesomes occurred. It's how thoroughly the church tried to document them. Monastic scribes took down confessions in grim Latin shorthand, cloaked in euphemism, but easy enough to decode with some patience. There's an entire margin note in one 14th century manuscript where a priest adds, "The sin was of the third degree. He who receives and he who watches are alike condemned." Bit judgy, but impressively poetic. And then there's the penitentials, guides for confessors, dense little books full of obscure but very specific sins. One from Anglo-Saxon England explicitly mentions the woman who lies with two men at once, or the man who engages both maid and mother. Yep, that's in there. The penance? 7 years of fasting or a pilgrimage to Rome, if you could afford the trip. Some of the juiciest records come from annulment cases. In one, a woman petitions to leave her husband after discovering that he regularly shared her with his traveling companion, a German of poor hygiene but bold disposition. That's the actual wording, bless the translator. The court found the marriage invalid, partly due to non-consensual triune arrangement, which sounds like a cursed medieval jazz trio. Of course, not everyone involved in these affairs got caught, but when they did, the punishments varied wildly. In Florence, a trio accused of a same-sex menage was sentenced to public flogging, except that local merchants intervened and paid the fine to spare their reputations. In contrast, a nun in Bologna who confessed to group lapses was walled into a tiny stone cell with only a slot for bread and water. Stark reminder, the more power you lacked, the less the system forgave. There's one fringe theory that some of these records were deliberately kept vague to protect elite participants. After all, when a duke's name shows up in a brothel raid, suddenly the ink gets smudged. Unidentified nobleman, the scribe writes. Convenient. But some records are surprisingly detailed, perhaps too detailed. A particularly eccentric 15th century bishop in Prague compiled a list of sins heard in whispers from beds and benches. One entry includes the phrase, "a chair built for three," which has left historians guessing. Was it furniture design? Or something a bit Creative? You pause now in the silent scriptorium, running your fingers across the edges of a centuries-old confession. The ink has faded, but the shame, the scandal, and the desire still breathe between the lines. These weren't just stories. They were people caught in a system that both punished and secretly obsessed over their pleasures. And if you're feeling like the church had a bit of a voyeur streak, well, you're not alone. Some scholars believe these records weren't just for spiritual correction, but also acted as social control, reinforcing who got to experiment and who got made into an example. Which is why we know so much about peasant transgressions and so little about royal ones. You step out of the archive now, back into the cool night air. The stars above are the same ones that once watched over Alice of York, the Knight of Avignon, and all the other tangled trios whose names are mostly forgotten. But their stories live on, bound in vellum, whispered in courts, and occasionally sung as folk songs at poorly supervised weddings. You're walking now along the stony corridors of a medieval monastery, but something's off. The candles flicker too warmly. The laughter behind closed doors seems a little too secular. You lean closer to a worn oak door and catch the faint clink of goblets. Welcome to the private lives of monks, priests, and nuns, those sworn to chastity, obedience, and sometimes a little extra company under the blanket of night. Because here's the thing, vows are human-made, and so were the people who broke them. Tonight, you're tiptoeing into the world of ecclesiastical temptation, of cloistered threesomes, secret liaisons, and those deeply ironic moments where a monk preaching against sin forgot to close his own cell door. One of the earliest records of such, from 12th century France, tells of a traveling priest who held private confessions for two women at once, often and with increasing enthusiasm. When caught, he allegedly claimed that temptation must be understood to be overcome. That's a line worth engraving. Historians still argue whether threesomes within religious orders were widespread or just dramatically overrepresented in scandals. But the documentation is there. From court records, bishopric investigations, and, more awkwardly, from the personal journals of monks who seem to use their diaries as both confessional and humble brag. There's one from a Carthusian monastery where a brother writes of being visited in dreams by twin spirits in womanly form. He later mentions being awakened by the abbot, suggesting those dreams might not have been entirely imaginary. The phrasing? The flesh stirs where the spirit falters. Beautiful. Conflicted. Guilty as charged. Let's not forget the nuns. Many were forcibly cloistered by their families. Not all were there by choice. In one notorious 15th century case from Italy, 3 nuns were accused of maintaining a shared companionship with a local cantor. The phrasing in the court document is telling. He entered at vespers and did not emerge till matins. The case was quietly closed after a large donation was made to the bishopric. Some monasteries even developed coded language to talk about these breaches. The term spiritual visitation began appearing in ledgers, often next to oddly large food allocations. A trio of monks in Cornwall were discovered hoarding honey cakes and wine, and when questioned, admitted they were preparing for guests of uncommon soul. Sounds like a euphemism for something stickier than honey. There's also that one account from a German abbey where an older monk supposedly instructed younger initiates in how to resist temptation by demonstrating what to avoid. Repeatedly, with the same 2 novices. According to surviving testimony, he said, "One cannot train against fire without feeling its heat." That's both theological and deeply suspicious. Interestingly, the punishments for religious trios varied wildly. Some are reassigned to more remote outposts. Others were confined in isolation. One nun who repeatedly engaged in triadic disobedience was made to wear a hair shirt for 7 years and forbidden from singing. Harsh, considering singing was her only joy. Still, she later appears in a letter, asking forgiveness and describing the quiet madness of living without touch. That letter was never answered. But then, there were those who got away with it. High-ranking abbots, bishops, even cardinals, often had enough clout to keep their companions close and the gossip at bay. In Avignon during the papal court, A satirical poem circulated mentioning 3 hats, 2 beds, and 1 holy sin. The identities remain uncertain, though the initials suspiciously match 2 cardinals and a noblewoman who mysteriously donated a vineyard to the church shortly afterward. One fringe scholar even suggests some of these trios were ritualistic, meant to purify the spirit by exhausting the flesh. It's a stretch, but not unprecedented. Certain mystic traditions believed in experiencing sin fully to transcend it. Whether that's spiritual awakening or convenient loophole, you decide. You duck now into a smaller chamber, where parchment and candlelight flicker. A forgotten scroll lies open, a prayer overwritten with love notes in the margins. To my 2 lights, who guide me in night and shadow. No name, just ink, longing, and a pressed violet tucked between the pages. In the world of the cloister, where silence reigned and temptation was supposed to be conquered, the quietest rebellions sometimes involved not just 1, but 2 forbidden loves. And somehow, despite the vows and surveillance, those rebellions found room to breathe. You step back out into the cloister walk, the bells tolling above. Somewhere behind you, a door closes gently, and you can't help but wonder, not about who broke the rules, but how many hearts never got the chance to. A soft wind brushes past your ear as you move toward the market square. Quieter now, late into the medieval night, but still echoing with the day's chaos. And in that bustling swirl of villagers, vendors, and vagabonds, another truth lingers. Not every threesome was about rebellion or religious scandal. Sometimes it was simply a matter of economics, convenience, or survival. Let's talk about sex work. In medieval cities, brothels were often licensed by the state, taxed by local councils, and, ironically, protected by the same knights who preached chastity. They were establishments of layered contradiction. Some were lavishly appointed, especially in places like Paris or Bruges, with private rooms, oil lamps, and warmed wine. Others were dingy backroom setups tucked into alleyways where straw counted as luxury. Either way, if you entered, you were offered choices. One of those was 1, 2, or all 3. Yes, group encounters were absolutely on the medieval menu. Threesomes weren't seen as taboo, so much as costly. In many brothels, there was even a set fee scale. Solo service, couple service, or, if your purse jingled loud enough, a full fellowship. Historians still argue whether such encounters were genuinely consensual among workers or more a result of desperate economics. Some brothels were staffed by women who had autonomy and power, even managing finances and schedules. Others operated under darker circumstances, with trafficked individuals, orphans, or debt slaves coerced into pleasing more for less. The records don't always clarify, but what's clear is that threesomes were not an uncommon request. A popular 14th century manual for tavern owners actually included a passage on arranging comfortable diversions for 3 or more, suggesting these arrangements weren't just tolerated, they were systematized. Think Airbnb, but with fewer linens and more negotiation. There's also the curious case of traveling performers. Picture a wandering troupe, juggler, flute player, dancer, offering both entertainment and companionship. It wasn't unusual for these troupes to stage body skits that evolved, shall we say, into private performances. One account from Avignon describes a nobleman who hired the trio entire, resulting in both a show for his guests and a very long night upstairs. The line that historian added, "The performance ended in candlelight, but the laughter continued till dawn." In port towns, sailors were known to pool their money to purchase shared time with a pair of sex workers. One surviving ledger from a 15th century Venetian even itemizes a line for na compagnia di tre, a company of 3. Sometimes that company included 2 men and 1 woman, other times the reverse. Very occasionally, 3 of one kind. As long as coins changed hands, the church seemed remarkably blind to specifics. And then there were the girls of the bath. These weren't simply washerwomen. Public bathhouses, especially in German cities, became eroticized spaces. Mixed-gender nudity, massages, wine served poolside. It was a short leap from washing backs to warming beds. The phrase two for scrubbing, one for sighing shows up in a joke poem from the era. If you get it, you get it. Of course, the authorities tried, now and then, to crack down. Edicts were passed forbidding more than one worker to enter a chamber at a time. Windows were bricked up, fines were levied, but they rarely stuck. The demand never really waned. People have always found ways to get around locked doors. Sometimes all it took was an extra coin under the table, or a wink at the guards. There's a rather charming anecdote from a Welsh town where three regulars were nicknamed the Trinity by brothel workers. They always arrived together, paid in fresh bread from one's bakery, ale from the second's tavern, and firewood from the third's delivery business. The women reportedly called it Blessing Day. It's both wholesome and horrifying. And let's not ignore the art. Marginalia in manuscripts sometimes depicted little scenes of threesomes. Not always explicit, but often winkingly suggestive. A nun chasing two monks. A goat watching two peasants with a bucket. Medieval humor was weirdly obsessed with buckets, for reasons no one has fully explained. There's a fresco in Tuscany showing a blindfolded woman being serenaded by two men playing instruments. Except if you tilt your head, those instruments are definitely metaphors. Whether this was erotic art or just someone being cheeky while painting a chapel wall. Well, scholars are still bickering. You leave the market square now, the last of the candle sellers packing up. There's a half-finished song echoing from second-story window. Something about love and three hearts and too little time. It trails off into laughter. Medieval threesomes weren't just about scandal or spectacle. Sometimes they were transactions. Sometimes they were friendships that blurred. And sometimes they were simply ways for people, lonely, tired, starved of touch, to feel alive for a moment in a world that offered little softness. The city quiets. A shutter creaks shut. The cobbles hold their secrets, golden tongues of light clinging to melted wax. You move slowly now, your feet bare on the stone, the night wrapping you like an old cloak. One last place to stop before sleep claims the village. And you, in the hush of the monastery library, yes, you're sneaking in again, you come across a strange little codex tucked behind a copy of the Natura Rerum. No title on the spine, no gold leaf initials. But the pages are soft, worn, and surprisingly juicy. This, it turns out, is a confessio, a collection of anonymous sins gathered by a 13th century monk who asked people to write down their worst impulses and deeds. It was never meant to be published. But here it is, handwritten in Latin and riddled with, well, medieval people being very human. One story tells of a farmer's daughter who confesses to lying with two plowboys under the hay wagon, while her father was at Massachusetts. Another features a priest, a widow, and a traveling fiddler sharing the devil's warmth one stormy evening. There's even a poetic entry from a nun who wrote, "We were three in prayer, but one candle kept going out." Historians still argue whether the monk who compiled this was horrified or secretly amused. Some even suggest he might have embellished the more dramatic confessions for flair. But one thing's for sure. He preserved a slice of medieval intimacy no official record dared to keep. Because here's the final twist. In a world that painted sin in bold black lines, the people living in it often colored outside the margins. Threesomes weren't common, per se, but neither were they rare enough to be erased. They existed in the laughter behind tavern doors, in the giggles exchanged behind nunnery walls, in the unspoken glances across festival crowds. The church huffed and puffed, but human longing always found a loophole. There's even a folk tale from Brittany about a fox spirit that appears to lonely shepherds in the night, not as a vixen, but as three women at once, offering comfort, mystery, and distraction. If the shepherd resists, he is rewarded with good fortune. If he succumbs, he wakes in the morning with straw in his hair and no memory of the night, only a vague, aching bliss. Make of that what you will. In one medieval sermon, a frustrated friar warns his congregation that even the devil now travels in trios. Probably because he knew that two's company, but three? That's temptation with choreography. Still, Not all threesomes were acts of lust or rebellion. Some were rooted in desperation, like that plague year chronicle where a sick wife begged her husband to lie with her, and they're made together, hoping to conjure life back into her bones. Did it work? Probably not. But the moment must have felt holy in its own strange, chaotic way. And now, back in your borrowed sandals, you tiptoe down the hallway of that monastery, your hand trailing along cold stone. You imagine the scribe who copied that little confession book by candlelight, pausing every now and then to chuckle or sigh. You imagine the people he was writing about, flawed, yearning, occasionally foolish, but oh so real. The Middle Ages were many things: brutal, beautiful, devout, hypocritical. And like every era, they were filled with people who broke the rules not because they hated them, but because being human is messy. 3 hearts, 2 beds, 1 secret. Sound about right. You blow out the last candle. The world goes dark. So now, with the night stretched thin and the stars whispering above, let's breathe. Let's soften everything. The noise, the heat, the laughter that still lingers from our long journey through candlelit bedrooms and whispered sins. Picture the soft hush of a medieval village at midnight. The lanterns dim. The market's empty. Somewhere in the distance, a lute plays its last sleepy chord. And behind closed doors, people are curling into each other. Not always neatly, not always legally, but always human. Maybe you're lying on cool sheets now, or curled into the arm of a chair. Maybe your phone is almost slipping from your fingers. Wherever you are, it's okay to let the edges blur. History doesn't need to stay sharp at this hour. Let it melt like beeswax in the heat. You just walked centuries in someone else's sandals. You've stood in shadows with peasants, monks, nobles, and nuns. You've peeked behind the curtains history often leaves closed. And through it all, you've seen one thing clearly. That desire, awkward and unfiltered, doesn't obey timetables, or theology, or even common sense. It just is. So rest now. Let the stories fade into a soft hum, like a lullaby sung in an unfamiliar tone. The past is still out there, half truth, half dream, but for tonight, you've walked close enough to hear it breathe. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.